On a crisp fall morning in 2007, a small airplane took flight over the forested town of Graham, Washington. The pilot was a detective with the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, and he was flying a somewhat unusual mission. He wasn't looking for a lost person or chasing a fleeing suspect. Instead, he was circling the sky above the scene of a double murder case that had him and his whole department stumped. The detective had run out of ideas on the ground, so he decided to take flight. Plus, he always thought better in the air, and he figured, while he was up there, he would literally get a new perspective on his evidence. This way, he eventually circled over the house where the homicides took place and then also began to kind of loosely circle the neighborhood. And that's when he noticed something. It was something that he wouldn't have noticed on the ground, but from up here, it was incredibly obvious. With a rush of adrenaline, he turned his plane around and headed back toward the airfield. He now had a real hunch, and if it was right, that means he just solved the case. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the follow button you want to show them something funny, then put a mirror directly in front of them. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a Sunday morning in October of 2007, 30-year-old Brian Mack stood just inches away from his TV set, anxiously watching the Seattle Seahawks football team line up on the goal line, about to run a play. His living room was filled with friends who had come over to watch the game as well, and who were there to eat the eggs and bacon and biscuits and gravy that he cooked. On TV, the quarterback suddenly threw the ball to the wide receiver, but the pass was intercepted, and the living room erupted in boos and groans. Brian turned and kissed his 28-year-old wife, Beverly. Anyway, win or lose, Brian and Bev were still die-hard Seahawks fans, and in fact, were actually season ticket holders. And when the Seahawks were playing on the East Coast during away games like today, they would always invite their friends over for a breakfast watch party, because the games would start on the East Coast at 1 p.m. Eastern, and then on the West Coast where they were, that would be 10 p.m., hence the breakfast watch party. Brian and Bev loved hosting their friends. It was exactly what they had imagined doing when they bought this house a year earlier. The couple had gotten married about 18 months ago, and so they still were very much in their honeymoon phase. They lived in this modest ranch-style home with a nice front porch on the rural outskirts of Graham. They had 5 acres of land with breathtaking views of Mount Rainier out back. The neighborhood was sparsely populated. There was only one house close by with plenty of wide open space in between. Their closest neighbors lived in a trailer across a field behind their house. It was perfect for the couple. They were both very outdoorsy, not really cut out for typical office jobs and that kind of life. On their days off, they loved doing things like taking scenic rides on their motorcycles or kayaking in the Puget Sound. But no hobby trumped the pure joy of watching their beloved Seahawks play. The first half of the game came to an end, and Brian walked out of the living room and into the kitchen, where he topped off his cup of coffee. As he stood there drinking it, he noticed the kitchen rash was full, so he put his coffee down and grabbed the bag to take it outside. Brian walked to the bins out back and tossed the bag of trash inside, then turned to walk back into the house. As he did, he heard a car rumbling down the road. He looked up to see his neighbor, Daniel, sitting in the passenger seat, and the two men exchanged a quick wave. Daniel and his wife were the ones who lived in that trailer across the field and, like most of the residents around here, they enjoyed the quiet and mostly kept to themselves, but they were perfectly friendly. But just then, from inside the house, Brian heard somebody yelling angrily. Instantly, he knew it had to be his friend Randy Holmes, and as he thought that, he felt a pit form in his stomach. Randy was clearly slurring his words, which was not out of character. He was only invited to this party because he was cousins with one of Brian's close friends. He could be okay, but he was young, just 21 years old, and a very heavy drinker. This was not the first time he'd come over and gotten belligerent. Bev also was not fond of Randy, and she and Brian also knew that Randy had actually been in trouble with the law before. They just didn't know the specifics. But Brian did still let him come over for parties so as not to make things awkward with his cousin. So Brian picked up his pace and ran inside to see what was going on. In the living room, the mood was obviously tense. Randy was standing in the middle of the floor, yelling at no one in particular. Everybody else was giving him a wide berth, trying not to provoke him further. When Randy got like this, it was impossible to reason with him. Randy pointed at Brian's friend, Justin, and shouted drunk nonsense like he was deliberately trying to start a fight with him. Brian stepped forward, putting himself between Randy and the other party guests, and he told him to chill out. But that only set Randy off. Randy stumbled toward Brian, cursing and swaying on his unsteady feet until they were chest to chest. Then Randy shoved Brian, not hard though, since he was too drunk to put any real power behind it. Besides, Brian was a big guy and he wasn't exactly easily moved. In fact, if anything, the shove just sort of knocked Randy off balance. And Brian seized the opportunity to grab him by the arms and literally drag him across the living room to the front door. And when they got to the front door, Randy just kept on shouting, and Brian had to physically push him outside into the yard, and then he told Randy to just go home. Randy kept on cussing and yelling at Brian, but he also seemed to realize that he was physically outmatched here. He spat on the lawn and then gathered himself undambled back to his car. Brian watched him weave his way off the property and drive down the street toward his own home, music blasting out of his car windows. The moment Randy was out of sight, Brian exhaled, his body full of adrenaline. He'd seen Randy pretty bad, but never that combative before, and it sort of unnerved him. He shook his head, wondering what set Randy off in the first place. Brian turned and walked back inside. The second half was about to start, and he hoped the Seahawks would start playing a bit better and maybe take his mind off what had just happened. That evening, Bev felt exhausted as she and Brian picked up after the party. She didn't have the stamina to fully clean the whole house, but she at least wanted to get all the beer cans and booze bottles into a recycling bin, maybe do a few dishes before bed. She told Brian she'd put on some music while they tittied up, and then she went to go grab her phone, which she'd left in the kitchen all day charging it. But when she got to the charger was still plugged into the wall, but her phone was gone. She called for Brian, asking if he had seen it, but he leaned his head into the kitchen and said no. Not since earlier when it was charging right there on the counter. So he offered to help her find it. But as they began to tear apart the living room looking for her phone, a sinking feeling settled in Beverly's stomach. Randy had been in the kitchen a few minutes before his drunken outburst. Bev sighed and turned to Brian and asked him if Randy had used their bathroom while he was over. Brian shrugged and said, "Yeah, at least once or twice. I mean, he was here for a few hours." Bev sighed again. She was willing to bet that Randy very likely had been casing their new house while he wandered down the hallway to the toilet. You know, maybe he was taking things. She told Brian he better go check his hunting equipment. Then she ran into the bedroom and flipped open her jewelry box, and thankfully, nothing was missing. But Brian soon appeared in the doorway, very pale in the face, and said one of his guns was gone. And so now it became very clear that, Randy had probably taken the gun, taken her phone, and who knows what else. Bev asked if maybe they should just call the police. She was already scared of Randy. But now, knowing that he very likely also stole from them, including a firearm, what's to say he wasn't planning to retaliate after Brian threw him out of their house? But Brian said no, we can't do that. Randy was a live wire. It was probably best not to confront him, especially not with police. Besides, everybody at the party was drinking. Maybe the gun and the phone were just misplaced. They should just finish cleaning the house in the morning, and very likely everything would turn up then. 6 weeks later, on the evening of Friday, November 16th, Brian packed up some of his hunting equipment so it'd be ready for the morning. Then he went to brush his teeth before bed. He had plans to go hunting before sunrise with his friend, just on white, and wanted to get to bed early so he'd be well rested. Brian and Bev still hadn't found Bev's phone or Brian's gun that disappeared during that party. At this point, they were both certain that Randy had stolen both items, but they weren't sure how to get their stuff back without involving the police or making things awkward with Randy's cousin. So they had agreed to wait a bit longer and just see if Randy tried to return the items with some kind of flimsy excuse. In the meantime, Bev was okay without her if Owen and Brian had other guns. So Brian crawled into bed and soon his wife joined him, and in just a few minutes, they were both fast asleep. Around 5 a.m. the following morning, Brian's friend just pulled his SUV into Brian and Bev's driveway, ready to pick up Brian for a morning of hunting. However, the house was completely dark. Justin couldn't see any lights on inside. For a moment, Justin did just idle there in the driveway waiting, taking the last few swigs out of his tumbler of coffee. But he'd been up for a while already, so he was wide awake and pretty anxious to get to their hunting spot. He thought about going up to the door to knock, but he knew if he did that, he very likely would wake up Beverly since, it was the weekend and it's 5. So she very likely was asleep. So instead, Justin just let his headlights shine in through the front windows, figuring that if Brian was awake by now, he would see the light and come outside. But after about 5 minutes of that, when still Brian had not come outside, Justin decided this was a lost cause and he pulled out of the driveway. He figured his friend must still be asleep, so Justin decided he would go hunting alone that day. He drove to the woods on the outskirts of Graham, and as he did, he kept checking his phone. He figured Brian would wake up any second, feel bad, and ask him to turn around and come pick him up. But the call never came. And then, when Justin actually got to the hunting spot and was walking around out in the woods, he kept checking his phone, but still there was nothing. And then once the sun began to creep over the tree line, Justin started to get worried. By this point, Brian definitely should have been up, and it was weird that he hadn't called Justin to at least apologize for missing the trip. Finally, after a few hours of unsuccessful hunting, Justin walked back to his car and just called Brian, but there was no answer. At this point, something in his gut told him to go back to Brian's house to check on his friend one more time. Justin pulled into Brian and Bev's driveway for the second time that morning, and it looked like the house had not changed at all, No lights were on. The cars were in the same spot. It was all the same. And so Justin hopped out of his SUV and headed to the porch to ring the doorbell. But when he got to the top step, he looked down unnoticed that one of the wooden panels on the door looked like it had been kicked in. He hadn't noticed this earlier, but it had been dark out, so maybe he hadn't seen it. And then Justin heard something coming from inside the house. He peered through one of the windows into the living room, and he realized the noise was coming from their TV set. And he saw something else too. It sort of looked like a pile of blankets on the floor. This was strange. Bev and Brian were always very neat and tidy, and so it was unlike them to leave blankets strewn around. So Justin squinted, trying to get a better look. And as he did, he realized he was not looking at a pile of blankets. In a panic, Justin ran for the door and tried it, but it was locked. So he rushed to his SUV, grabbed his phone, and called 911. Moments later, a Pierce County Sheriff's Department deputy was driving through Graham in his patrol car when a call from dispatch came over the radio. They requested assistance for a possible injured person at a house on 70th Avenue East. This deputy happened to be in the area, so he said he would go check it out. It took him less than 10 minutes to get to the address. As he pulled up, he saw a man standing in the driveway next to an SUV, rubbing his hands together. The man seemed very nervous and began to approach the deputy's car. The man introduced himself as Justin and began kind of stumbling over his words as he recounted that morning. He said he pulled up to the house and it was dark, and then he circled back after a fruitless hunting trip. And his voice shook when he explained what he saw when he came back, that he could actually see somebody lying on the floor inside the house. The deputy told Justin to stay put and not to follow him into the house. Then, the deputy placed a hand on the holster of his gun and crept up the front stairs. He knocked on the front door, eyeing the broken wood panel that Justin had mentioned. When there was no response, the deputy pushed the door open and stepped inside the house. Immediately, he saw a long trail of blood that led from the front door into the living room. This was clearly way too much blood to just be somebody's simple injury. This very likely had to be a crime scene. The deputy grabbed his radio and called the sheriff's department for backup. Then he unholstered his gun and began moving slowly, following the blood trail into the living room. The trail led the deputy to a bloody sheet lying on the floor. An arm and a leg protruded from underneath the sheet. The deputy looked at the outline of the lumpy mass underneath the sheet and saw it was clearly too big to just be one person. He knew he was looking at two bodies dead on the floor. Now, the deputy knew, obviously, this was going to command his attention at some point. But for now, he needed to search the house and make sure there wasn't anybody here, like the perpetrator or perpetrators. And so, with his gun drawn, he searched the whole house. And when he was satisfied that the house was indeed empty, he made his way back to the driveway to wait for backup. He also wanted to get more information from Justa. However, when the deputy got outside, he was surprised to find that the driveway was empty. Justin White was gone. About 10 minutes later, Detective Sergeant Ben Benson pulled up outside of Brian and Beverly Mock's house. Benson was a 23-year veteran of the force and the lead investigator. He arrived on the scene with one of his team members, Detective Jason Tate. The two detectives climbed out of their car, and Benson gave Tate a very encouraging nod. Tate had just made detective a few months ago, and this would be his first major homicide case. Benson surveyed the neighborhood, or what he could see of it, given how dispersed it was. He told Tate to take a walk around to get the lay of the land and then start trying to reach the victim's family. Tate nodded and headed down the street. Meanwhile, Benson headed up the driveway to Brian and Beverly's home. A police team was already marking the perimeter of the house with yellow caution tape. Benson dipped under the tape, and a deputy came down the driveway to meet him. The deputy told him that he was the one who responded to the 911 call. He motioned to the open front door and said that Brian and Beverly Mock's bodies were inside. Benson headed for the door, and the deputy followed. He told Benson about Justin White, the friend who had called 911 and then disappeared while the deputy was investigating the house. He said it just felt weird. Justin had seemed so concerned about his friend's well-being, but then didn't stick around to see if they were actually okay. Benson thanked the deputy. It was a good lead, one he had every intention of pursuing after he assessed the crime scene inside the house. A forensic team was already busy collecting evidence. Benson pulled on a pair of disposable gloves as he followed the trail of blood from the front door to the two bodies piled in the living room. There, he knelt down and lifted up the edge of the sheet that was covering them, and he was met with a grisly scene. Brian was face down on the ground wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Bev was on top of him, but completely naked, and they had both clearly been shot repeatedly in the head. So it was no wonder the floor around the bodies was completely soaked in blood. There were pools of blood, smudges, and smears, and smears, and smears. It looked like someone did a poor job of trying to clean up, and when they couldn't sop up the mess, they just sort of covered the crime scene with a few blankets. Benson looked down at the trail of blood which clearly had been created when the killer dragged Brian or Beverly from the front door into the living room. But the trail sort of looked strange. The blood was streaked with these long, thin lines. He couldn't imagine what had caused them. Benson moved around the living room looking for clues. Forensics had already found an imprint of a shoe in the pool of blood beneath the sheet, right by Brian's body, but otherwise there were no footprints in the house. As Benson walked through the house, he began to notice blood smears in odd places like on white switches, and there was a bloody smear on the door jamb leading into the bedroom. It looked like the killer tried to clean up the scene, but then ended up making a bigger mess in the process. And yet, for all the carnage, nothing else in the house was a mess. None of the drawers had been ripped from the dresser. The jewelry box looked untouched. There were plenty of valuables just lying around the house still. I mean, this clearly was not a burglary gone wrong. The killer had enough time to wander around and get blood smears everywhere, but apparently had no interest in stealing anything. Benson circled back to the living room where forensics was still dusting and photographing the scene. He looked over at the kicked-in front door. The killer clearly was not let into the home, which meant they were either a stranger to Brian and Beverly or someone they didn't want to let inside. All things considered, Benson's money was on the latter scenario, someone that Brian and Beverly knew but didn't trust who showed up at their house, kicked down the door, and killed them. And given that Beverly was naked, Benson also had to consider the possibility that she was sexually assaulted as well. There was a lot of anger in this murder. It felt personal, but the question was who wanted Brian and Bev dead. An hour later, Detective Benson pulled his car up to the house of Justin White. The house looked quiet, and Justin's SUV was in the driveway, so he appeared to be home. Benson walked up to the front door and knocked, and a moment later Justin opened the door looking pale. And his first question was, are Bev and Brian okay? Benson paused for a moment and then told Justin that he likely already knew the answer to that question. Justin just sort of swallowed hard but didn't respond. So Benson asked him why he fled the scene so quickly after the deputy arrived. Justin's voice trembled as he explained that he just couldn't stay there, not after what he'd seen, or what he thought he'd seen on the floor inside the house. Brian was one of his best friends. He couldn't believe that something could happen to him. And then once the deputy showed up, it all just seemed too real. He just couldn't handle it, and so he panicked and drove off. He said he regretted leaving, but he just couldn't seem to turn the car around. Benson listened to this skeptically. On one hand, it was suspicious that Justin essentially fled the scene. But, on the other hand, Benson knew that in high-stress situations people did weird things and sometimes they made themselves look really guilty out of just fear or panic. In Benson's experience, the best way to find the truth was to look for physical evidence that either corroborated or contradicted the stories they told. So as Justin spoke, Benson scanned his hands and forearms looking for any marks that maybe Brian or Beverly left. The crime scene he had just left was bloody and violent and brutal. I mean, the killer was very likely to show some signs of a fight, but Benson couldn't see any cuts or scratches on Justin. He wasn't sure what to think, but just to be safe, Benson told Justin he would likely have more questions for him in the coming days. By the time Benson got back to the Mox home around noon, their quiet investigation had turned into a full-blown circus. The whole neighborhood was swarming with cops. Also, reporters from several local media outlets were stalking the street, asking for interviews with basically anyone who would give them the time of day. Benson did his best to dodge the journalists until he could duck under the yellow caution tape and retreat up the Mox driveway. His partner, Detective Tate, was on the front porch to greet him, and he told Benson that he had just had a phone call with Beverly's mom, who supplied him with a viable suspect, a guy named Randy Holmes. Apparently, Brian and Bev thought that Randy stole a phone and a gun from their house about 6 weeks ago, the same day that Brian had to physically eject Randy from their party. Bev's mom said that she urged Beverly to go to the authorities, but the couple hadn't wanted to. But, according to the mom, Randy always made Beverly nervous. To Benson, this all sounded like a motive. He told Tate, "Great work." That's when a uniformed officer approached Benson and Tate, saying that one of them needed to come talk with the neighbor who lived in the trailer at the edge of the Mox property line. He apparently thought he saw something last night and wanted to help with the investigation. Tate knew that was his cue, and he told Benson he would call him with a report. Then he followed the officer across the field toward the trailer in question. Meanwhile, Benson headed back into the office. He wanted to learn whatever he could about Randy Holmes, including if he had a criminal record. It didn't take long for Benson to discover that not only did Randy have a record, but it was pretty extensive. Before the age of 21, Randy had been arrested for a litany of crimes including possession of a stolen vehicle, forgery, and violating a restraining order. And that last one was of particular interest because it suggested that Randy could be capable of violence. Benson grabbed the phone on his desk and called Detective Tate. He told Tate that Randy was looking like a pretty good suspect and he wanted to go and find him. Tate agreed and thought that was a good idea, and he also told Benson that he had some news too. He had just wrapped up an interview with Daniel and Jennifer Tavares, the husband and wife who lived in the trailer across the field from Brian and Beverly. And the couple said they didn't know the Mox very well, but Daniel said he did see something strange at the Mox house that morning. Around 7 JROM, Daniel said he had heard gunshots outside. There were a lot of hunters in the area, so gunshots were sort of common this time of the year. But he said he was still curious, so when he heard them, he peeked out his blinds towards the Mox house in time to see the men run out of Brian and Beverly's home, jump into a red pickup truck in the driveway, and peel out. Daniel said he did get a really good look at one of the two men. That guy had a ponytail that was tied back and his face was pockmarked and scraggly, like he hadn't shaved in a couple of days. As for the second guy, Daniel said he really didn't get a good look at him, but he could see enough to know that it definitely was a man. And so after saying all this, Tate followed up and asked Benson, hey, does that description match Randy? Benson thought for a minute. The photo he had seen of Randy did not show Randy having long hair or a pockmarked face. But, Daniel didn't get a good look at the second guy, and so maybe the second guy could have been Randy. Either way, such a detailed description would definitely help them figure out if Randy was their guy or involved. Benson told Tate to wrap up what he was doing and head back to the station. They had a suspect to track down. About 40 minutes later, Benson and Tate pulled down a dark residential street in Graham, looking for what they hoped would be Randy's home. Randy had given multiple different addresses over the years during different arrests, so Tate and Benson were going to try all of them, starting with the most recent. They squinted out the windows looking for house numbers, and for a moment, they thought they found his home, but then realized the number on that house had an extra digit. It took 2 more sweeps of the street for Benson and Tate to realize that, in fact, none of the house numbers on the street matched the address Randy had given his arresting officers. So, either the booking officer had made a mistake or Randy had given a fake address. Tate looked down at his notebook where he'd scribbled all of Randy's known addresses. He wondered aloud how many of them would be phony. But Benson, he just sighed and said this gave him even more reason to suspect Randy. I mean, everything about this guy was sketchy. The second address on their list took them to a real house, which was promising. But when they knocked on the front door, a middle-aged woman answered. She admitted to being Randy's mom, but said she hadn't seen her son in days, and she had no idea where he was. She looked genuinely concerned as she asked if he was in some kind of trouble. Benson felt bad for her. It seemed like this was definitely not the first time cops had come around looking for her son. So he handed her his card and told her he just had a few questions for Randy about a case they were working on. Randy's mother took it and promised to call if her son showed up. Back in the car, Benson pulled on his seatbelt. Meanwhile, Tate crossed off Randy's mother's address and rattled off the next house to try. Under the circumstances, it was bad news that not even Randy's mom could find him, and so Benson just hoped that he and Tate would have better luck. He pulled his car down the street and headed west, winding his way through Graham. The third address took them all the way to the outskirts of town where the street had disappeared and the road was suddenly full of potholes. Benson and Tate bounced their way down the uneven road, looking for Randy's house. Benson was beginning to think this was just another wild goose chase when he suddenly slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dirt because there, right up ahead, was a smoldering pile of rubble where Randy's alleged third home used to be. But all that was left were the remains of a charred foundation. The house had been burnt to the ground, and recently too. Tate climbed out of the car and went to go walk the perimeter of the burned-down home. Benson just leaned on the hood of the car, scratching his head. He was starting to worry that Randy was on the run. By the time Benson and Tate got back to the station, the preliminary results from the medical examiner had arrived. And so Benson sat at his desk looking over the report, and the details of the murder were absolutely depraved. Both Brian and Bev had been shot in the head 3 times at close range with a .22 caliber revolver. But to Benson's surprise, the rape kit used for Beverly came back negative, which meant that she suffered no sexual assault, either pre or post-mortem, despite having been found nude. Benson also had a report from the forensics department analyzing a palm print lifted from the blood smear on the bedroom door jamb, as well as the bloody shoe print they spotted by the bodies. They hadn't matched the palm print to anybody in the system yet, but they would run the prints against any that Benson collected from suspects. And so Benson really needed to find Randy Holmes. But before he could even start to formulate a new plan, Benson's phone rang. And when he answered, he was shocked because the voice on the other line belonged to none other than his #1 suspect, Randy Holmes. Randy said his mom told him that Detective Benson was looking for him. She hadn't said what it was about, but he'd heard about the murders of Brian and Beverly, and he figured it had to be related. He said he was staying with a friend about 10 miles away and wanted to come and unclear his name. Randy swore he had an alibi for the night of the murder, along with several friends who could back up his story. Now Benson had not been expecting this, So, pretty aggressively, he asked Randy for the names and phone numbers of these so-called friends, because he was going to call each and every one of them and ask them questions about Randy's alibi. Benson was hoping that the way he was asking, being sort of aggressive on purpose, would maybe get Randy to flinch or maybe refuse to give him contact information, to show he was guilty. But Randy reacted by saying, "Yeah, that's fine, all good." And then he encouraged Benson to make those calls, call all of them. And so Benson scribbled down the information as Randy rattled off a handful of names. Then Benson asked Randy point blank, did he steal a gun and a phone from the Mach house on the day of the football watch party? This was a test to see if Randy would lie, but Randy didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Yes, he did." He said he knew all of this made him look horrible, but he swore he did not hurt Brian or Beverly. Trying hard not to be completely thrown off by Randy's apparent honesty, Benson asked for the address where Randy was currently staying. He told Randy he was going to send Tate over to check out the stolen gun to see if it matched the weapon that killed Brian and Beverly, and Randy eagerly gave him the address. He told him the gun was with him right now and he'd be waiting for Detective Tate. Benson hung up and just sat there for a minute, absorbing this new twist. Then he stood up and walked across the room to Tate's desk. He handed over the address and asked him to go check it out. Then Benson got to work calling all of Randy's friends. An hour later, Benson sat dejectedly at his desk, sipping lukewarm coffee and skimming through his notes on the case so far. He just hung up with the last of Randy's friends, all of whom had confirmed that they were with Randy at a party on the night of the murder. Benson knew they could be lying to cover for their friend, but they all gave intricate details about the party, and all of those details matched. Their accounts were too nuanced and too overlapping to be lies. Benson had to reconcile the fact that Randy's whereabouts were accounted for during the murder. Just a few hours ago, he thought this case was basically solved. Now he was back to square one. Just then his phone rang. Benson answered and heard Tate's voice. He said he was at Randy's house and he had some more bad news. The stolen gun was not a match. Benson sighed and said, "Yep," he had a feeling that was going to be the case. Benson took another sip of coffee and he began to sift through more documents in the case file. He grabbed the interview that Tate conducted with Brian and Beverly's neighbor, the guy who lived in the trailer across the field, Daniel Tavares, who had seen the two men running out of the Mox house. Benson wondered if he should go speak to Daniel again just to see if maybe he remembered any other details that could help them crack the case. Or maybe, Benson thought, he should send Tate out to canvass again. This time asking neighbors if they recognized the man from Daniel's description, the guy with the ponytail and the pockmarked face. But whatever he decided to do, it was gonna have to wait until tomorrow. This was only the first day of the investigation and it was late. Benson and Tate both needed to go home and get some sleep. The next morning, on Sunday, Sergeant Benson climbed into the cockpit of a single-engine plane at the airstrip in Graham. He hoped that by flying over the Mox home, it could help him sort of reframe the evidence and show him what clues he could be missing. Benson glided through the blue skies, reviewing the details of the case in his mind over and over again. The door was kicked in. The victims' bodies were piled on top of one another and covered with a sheet. Their friend Justin was at the scene around the time of the murders but claimed that everything seemed normal until he came back hours later. Randy Holmes technically had a motive but no murder weapon and a decent alibi. And a neighbor saw two men running out of the Mox home around 7. Jarwam, one with a pockmarked face in the ponytail. What was he missing? Benson finally reached the Mox home and looked down from the cockpit. Even at this height, he could clearly see the yellow caution tape lining the property. Benson scanned all around the sparsely populated neighborhood below, quickly spotting Daniel Tavares' trailer parked across the field. He saw a trailer park even further down the road. Brian's friend Justin lived close, and Randy's mom's house wasn't that far away either. And as Benson was sort of staring around at all the places he had been on the ground with his partner, he noticed something he had totally overlooked while he was on the ground. He turned the plane around and headed right back to the airstrip. He now needed just one more piece of physical evidence and one more interview, and then he was certain he would be able to solve this case. Less than an hour later, Benson stood outside the sheriff's station as a squad car pulled up with his interview subject inside. Not because his subject was under arrest, They just didn't have a car and so needed a ride to the station. It had just rained out, and Benson watched as his subject stepped out of the cruiser and splashed through puddles to the station or to meet him. Benson thanked his subject again for agreeing to talk and then lead them inside. While Benson walked with the subject deeper into the station to an interview room, Detective Tate passed by them on his way towards the front door. As Benson opened up the interview room door and he and his subject began to go inside, Detective Tate reached the front door, stopped, and bent down. By the time Benson was actually sitting down opposite his subject inside of that room, Tate, out near the front door, was standing back up and smiling. Based on evidence and interviews collected over the course of 2 days by the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, this is what authorities believe happened to Brian and Beverly Mock on the morning of November 17, 2017. The killer arrived at Brian and Beverly's house early in the morning. A .22 caliber revolver in hand. They were furious because they felt like Brian had disrespected them, and the killer did not let anyone disrespect them, not even their own mother. The killer walked up to the front door and knocked, but even though they could hear the TV on inside, nobody answered. So, suddenly, in a rage, the killer just kicked in the door and stormed inside. From inside the house, Brian looked up in total shock, but the killer didn't hesitate. They raised their gun and fired. The first bullet struck Brian in the side of the head, and he crumpled to the ground. But the killer wasn't done. They walked over to Brian's body and fired 2 more shots directly into the back of Brian's head. The killer was about to leave, but they heard footsteps coming down the hallway. The killer looked up to see Beverly completely naked, her face frozen in terror. She screamed and ran for the front door, but the killer fired 2 more shots and both struck her in the back of the head. She fell. The killer stalked over to her, pressed the gun to her forehead, and pulled the trigger 1 more time. Then they dragged her lifeless body over to her husband's and stacked her right on top. It was only then that the killer looked around and saw the blood all over the house and realized what a mess they had made me. They flicked on a few lights to see what they were doing, then went to the kitchen to find some cleaning supplies. The killer found a broom and tried their best to wipe up the blood on the floor with it, but it didn't do any good. It just smeared the blood around, creating these long, thin streaks across the blood trail that would later confuse detectives. The killer realized they had to get creative, so they went into the master bedroom looking for extra blankets. As they walked through the threshold, they grabbed the door jamb, leaving behind a bloody smear. Then they opened up the closet and found a spare sheet. They carried it back out to the living room and used it to cover Brian and Beverly's bodies. The killer turned off all the light switches they had turned on, and then tried to wipe the blood off those switches. And then, feeling satisfied, they headed for the front door. But on their way, they stepped on the sheet, leaving behind a telltale shoe print of blood. Later that morning, a detective from the Pierce County Sheriff's Department would show up at the killer's front door asking questions about Brian and Beverly Mock. But, unbeknownst to any of the detectives, the killer had a dark and horrifying criminal past, and their many experiences with the police had turned them into a very good liar. So the killer was ready with a story that the police would believe for a full 24 hours. That is, until Detective Benson flew his plane over the crime scene and realized that story was physically impossible. That flight, that discovery, would trigger 1 more interview, and the subject was the killer. And because it had just rained when they walked through the entryway of the police station to the interview room, the killer would leave a shoe print on the station floor that Detective Tate would find, and that print would match the bloody footprint found at the crime scene. The killer was Brian and Beverly Mock's neighbor, Daniel Tavares. From the air, Benson had realized that Daniel's story about seeing 2 men running out of the Mock's house was actually impossible, because from the air he could clearly see that Daniel's home was simply too far away from the Mock's home to actually see that. And so, as soon as Benson made this realization, he rushed to the police station and summoned Daniel in for an interview. He also ran Daniel's name through the computer system looking for a criminal record, and what he found would go on to shock the entire country. Because Daniel Tavares had been released from a prison in Massachusetts only a few months earlier after serving 16 years for stabbing his own mother to death. Daniel was not supposed to leave the state of Massachusetts, but he had, and he fled to Washington. And no one from Massachusetts had come to look for him. So Daniel was technically already on the run from the law when he murdered the Mocks. Yeah, Daniel was so confident in his lie that when he went to the police station to be interviewed that last time, which would also be the day he would be arrested, wore the same boots that he had on at the time of the murder. However, once Benson finally confronted Daniel with all the police knew, including the fact they had matched the print he had left in the station to the one at the crime scene, Daniel would confess to the murders. He claimed he had done it because Brian apparently owed him $50 and also had somehow disrespected him. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Late on a June evening in 2000, a detective with the Eastern Pennsylvania Police Department's had in his car on a darkened neighborhood street, watching a house right nearby and waiting patiently. After what seemed like an eternity, finally, somebody emerged from this house, and in their hands were a couple of bulky trash bags. The detective tensed up, but they didn't move. The detective kept watching as this person placed the trash bags on the curb for pickup in the morning, and then this person went back inside the house. And right then is when the detective flung open his car door and, as quickly as he could, he darted across the street towards the house. But instead of going in to confront this person, he just grabbed their trash bags at the curb. Then, with these bags, he ran back to his car, stuffed the bags in his trunk, and he drove away. And as he drove away, he knew he was about to solve his murder case. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the follow buttons home and superglue all their doors shut. Okay, let's get into today's story. On May 28, 2000, an 18-year-old woman named Devin Guzman stood on a beach on the island of St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. She squinted her eyes from the sunlight as a tropical breeze blew lightly through her shoulder-length hair. Standing facing her was her girlfriend, Michelle Hetzel, who was also 18, and who was holding a pair of gold and diamond rings in her hand. Devin almost began to tear up as Michelle slipped one of the rings on her ring finger, and then Devin reached out and did the same, placing the other ring on Michelle's ring finger. Then, the young women held hands and recited vows to each other. Now, there was no priest or marriage officiant present, but for Devin, it didn't matter. She was spiritually and emotionally pledging to spend the rest of her life with Michelle. And in this moment, she couldn't imagine she could ever be happier. Their private little makeshift wedding ceremony during their Memorial Day weekend vacation almost felt like a fantasy. St. Croix was hundreds of miles away from Northampton County in Pennsylvania, where Michelle and Devin both lived. Michelle lived in a city called Easton, and Devin lived nearby in Forks Township. But life had been full of exciting changes recently for Devin. In the last 4 months, she'd moved out of her mom's house, gotten her own car, and started a full-time job as a cleaning technician for a company that repaired and restored property damage. And now, getting married to the woman she loved on a beach in the Caribbean felt like a romantic and fitting way to end a whirlwind couple of months. Now, Devin took Michelle's hand, and the two walked through the Worms into a tourist trap bar to celebrate with some cold drinks. However, after they got a table and the afterglow of exchanging vows began to fade along with the late afternoon sun, reality began to set in for Devin. Getting married to Michelle in a tropical paradise was one thing, but dealing with the repercussions back home from this marriage was going to be something else entirely. It wasn't homophobia that she was worried about. In 2000, there was still some social stigma associated with being a member of the labbed community, but Devin was confident and outspoken, and so this didn't bother her. What Devin was worried about, though, was the very complicated romantic situation that was waiting for her back home. Because despite the fact that Devin had just gotten, spiritually married to Michelle here on this beach, she was actually already living with her other girlfriend whose name was Carrie Renner. And that wasn't all. Our other girlfriend, Carrie, was actually also married to someone else, a man, although Carrie and her husband had actually been separated since he had left for the army to go to basic training in. But Devin's relationship with Carrie was a lot different than her relationship with her new spiritual wife, Michelle. Devin and Carrie fought a lot, and their fights often became physical. Sometimes, the police would have to come to break them up. Devin looked down at the pager clipped to her waist, and she was actually a little surprised that Carrie had not been paging her non-stop. Devin was planning to break up with Carrie as soon as she got home, and she really was not looking forward to the fight that would almost certainly cause. But she decided that, for right now, she wasn't going to think about any of that. Instead, she looked up and clinked her glass against Michelle's and took a sip of her cocktail. Later that night, Devin and Michelle were relaxing back in their hotel room. They were preparing to head back home the next day, and they were both sad and kind of stressed that their trip was almost over. Because going back home wasn't only going to be complicated for Devin, Michelle also had a difficult set of relationships waiting for her back in Pennsylvania. Just like Devin, Michelle was also married to someone else, a man named Brandon Bloss. Michelle had actually used Brandon's credit card to pay for this St. Croix trip. But also, just like Devin, Michelle was planning on breaking up with Brandon right when they got back home. However, Devin and Michelle had come up with a plan to make their transition into their new life of spiritual marriage together easier. And now, sitting on the hotel bed together, Devin put this plan into action. She picked up the hotel phone and called her father, Rick Guzman, who lived near her in Pennsylvania. When Hurd had answered, Devin told him about how she and Michelle had just gotten, spiritually married, and that she was planning to break up with Carrie, and then she asked if she and Michelle could come move in with him for a bit. Rick immediately said yes, and Devin knew, just from the sound of his voice, that he was actually thrilled with her news, because he knew all too well that her relationship with Carrie was sort of a nightmare. So, Devin thanked Hurd and said she loved him very much and hung up. Then she and Michelle went to sleep feeling happy. A few weeks later, at around 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, June 14th, Devin and Michelle were hanging out and drinking at Devin's father's house in Pennsylvania, like they often did these days. However, Devin and Michelle were not actually living there yet like they had planned to do way back in St. Croix, and this was because neither of them had actually broken up with their other partners yet, or had even told them about their spiritual wedding with each other. I mean, basically, they had kept everybody in the dark. And as this night wore on Devin and Michelle drank more and more, this fact started to become a point of contention between them and they started to bicker. Both of them were mad at the other for not fully committing. And so, a little after 9:00 p.m., Devin and Michelle each left the house feeling really mad, and they got into their own cars and they drove off to their own homes. A few minutes later, Devin stumbled drunkenly up the stairs and towards the door of the apartment that she still shared with Carrie that was right above a bar in Forks Township. She paused before she walked in. She was dreading the confrontation she knew was waiting for her inside. Devin looked down at the palm of her hand at a cut that had not quite finished healing yet. Only weeks earlier, after she had come home from St. Croix, she had tried to tell Carrie she did want to break up. But before she could say very much, Carrie had threatened to kill herself with a knife. And then, when Devin had tried to wrestle that knife out of her hands, Devin had gotten this big cut on her hands, which required a trip to the emergency room. And so, eventually, Devin took a deep breath, then reached down and turned the doorknob and walked inside. As expected, Carrie was waiting, and she was very upset. Devin couldn't hide the fact that clearly she had been out drinking. And also, she couldn't hide who she had been out drinking with. And so, naturally, they began to argue. And for the first time, Devin told Carrie that she and Michelle had exchanged wedding rings during their trip to St. Croix. And this made Carrie fly into a rage, and so she hit Devin and hit her right back. And then, before it could turn into a full-blown physical altercation, Devin's pager suddenly went off. She picked it up and saw that Michelle had actually been paging her non-stop. She just hadn't noticed. And so, quickly, she just walked away from Carrie and went into another room to call Michelle. And then, a few minutes later, she just came back into the living room where Carrie was still standing there fuming, and Devin told Carrie that, "Hey, Michelle's not feeling well, and so I'm gonna go over to her house and check on her." And Carrie was sort of caught off guard and just said, "Well, I'm going with you." And Devin, not wanting to argue anymore or have this escalate any further, told Carrie that fine, she could come thence, as long as she stayed in the car the whole time. So, at around 10:30 p.m., Devin pulled her car up to Michelle's house in Easton with Carrie sitting in the passenger seat. Devin reminded Carrie to remain where she was, and then Devin got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Devin knocked and Michelle's husband Brandon answered. And unsurprisingly, he said he would not let Devin inside. However, the reason he gave was because his wife, Michelle, was upset that Devin had come here with Carrie, and so he told Devin that if you want to come inside, you first have to bring Carrie home. And so Devin just turned around, walked back to her car, got inside, and informed Carrie that she was going to have to drive home and that she really didn't want to fight about it. And surprisingly, Carrie just sort of agreed because she didn't want to fight either. And at around 11:30 p.m., Devin dropped her off back at the Forks Township apartment. Devin did go into the apartment with Carrie for a little while, but then at about 12, Aji went back outside and left to return to Michelle's place. About 30 minutes later, around 12:30 a.m. on that Friday morning, the phone at Devin and Carrie's apartment began to ring. Carrie answered and heard Michelle's voice on the other line, and Michelle sounded really upset. She was demanding to know where Devin was. Carrie told Michelle to slow down here. She said Devin wasn't home because she had gone to your place. And when Michelle heard that, her voice turned frantic. She told Carrie that Devin had not returned to her house that evening and that she had been paging Devin over and over again. But Devin still had not called her back. Now, to Carrie, this seemed like classic Devin behavior. Devin had a habit of storming off dramatically and disappearing for a while and not talking to anybody, but she always came back. And so Carrie tried to reassure Michelle that, Devin would turn up soon. However, trying to reassure Michelle only made Michelle mad. Michelle began accusing Carrie of lying and started insisting that Devin must be with Carrie right now, and that Carrie was selfishly keeping Devin from seeing her. Then, very abruptly, Carrie heard Michelle slam the receiver down to hang up the phone. Carrie thought that was going to be the end of it. But about an hour and a half later, at about 2:30 in the morning, there was a loud knock on heard. And when Carrie answered, she found herself face to face with Michelle. And, just as Michelle had done over the phone, she once again began to aggressively accuse Carrie of literally hiding Devin in the apartment. But Carrie told Michelle she had nothing to hide, and to prove it, she let Michelle come in and look around for Devin. Carrie figured, once Michelle searched her apartment, she would chill out and realize Carrie was honestly telling the truth here. But Michelle did not chill out. Instead, after searching the apartment and not finding Devin, Michelle took out her phone and called 911. Hours later, still on that Friday morning, Carrie woke up in bed where she'd finally collapsed after being awake most of the night. The cops had come to her place after Michelle called 911, but they seemed totally uninterested in the fact that Devin could be missing. And since it hadn't been 24 hours since she'd been seen or heard from, they really couldn't even file a missing persons report. Instead, the cops issued what's called an attempt to locate report, which, as far as Carrie could tell, was basically the same thing but just way less urgent. And before Carrie could even begin to sort out all her thoughts, there was another knock on her door. And so Carrie got up and she opened it up, and once again, there was Michelle. And she looked like she literally hadn't slept. And then she would say that, yep, she'd been up all night and all morning just calling Devin's pager over and over again and just not getting an answer. Carrie rubbed her eyes and told Michelle to please calm down, that she was just making herself crazy hearing. But Michelle ignored her and suggested they should both drive around together and see if they could literally just go find Devin, since it was obvious the cops were not going to be much help here. Carrie did not really want to go drive around with Michelle, but she figured, at the very least, it would get Michelle out of her apartment. So Carrie got dressed and got into Michelle's car, and the two of them drove around town scouting all the usual places they would go to with Devin. But realistically, Carrie was barely paying attention. She thought the whole thing was a big waste of time and that Devin was sure to turn up soon on her own. That is until around 1:00 p.m., when they arrived at a place called Canal Park, which was this gravel parking lot in Easton right next to a river. Because as they pulled into the lot, Carrie saw Devin's car, a silver Pontiac Sunfire with a rainbow sticker on the bumper. And so, as soon as Michelle came to a stop, Carrie jumped out of the car and ran over to Devon's car and tried to open the door, but it was locked. She banged on the window in frustration and tried to look inside, but the windows were tinted, so she couldn't see anything. But then she remembered she actually had a spare key in her pocket. So she pulled it out, unlocked the door, opened it up, and when she did, she screamed. A half an hour later, Detective Barry Golazzi, double Yuski of the Easton Police Department stepped out of his cruiser at Canal Park. As he slipped under the yellow police tape that cordoned off the area, Golazzi double Yuski mentally ran through what dispatch had told him. 2 women had discovered the body of their friend, another young woman named Devin Guzman. He looked over and saw 2 crying women in the park and figured, those must be the 2 women who found the body. Golazzi, double Yuski, just shook his head. Easton was not the kind of place where you would expect to find a dead teenager in a parking lot. Nonetheless, he walked over to the car to get a look for himself. Peering in through the open rear door, Devin's body was curled up on the back seat, facing the rear of the car and covered by a green jacket. He slipped on a pair of disposable gloves and went in for a closer look. He peeled back the jacket, and right away he saw a gaping wound on the front of Devin's neck. But he noticed right away that there was very little blood for such a major injury, and her clothes weren't covered in blood either, which is what he would have expected. Instead, he just saw dirt and grass stains. He scanned the interior of the car and saw that it too was pretty clean, although one of the floor mats was missing. But the strangest detail was what Devin had clenched in her hand. She was holding the kitchen knife. Something about this didn't sit right to Golazzi double Yuski. The knife in Devin's hand seemed to suggest she might have cut her own throat. But slitting your throat was a horrible way to die. Besides, there was almost no blood, barely any in the car and none on the knife. So, to Golazzi double Yuski, he felt like this was not a suicide. This was a murder staged to look like a suicide. Just then, the coroner's car pulled into the gravel lot, signaling to the detective that it was time for him to get a move on. Golazzi double Yuski grabbed a cop standing nearby and told him to have both Devin's car and the car her friends had been driving when they found her impounded. Immediately, Devin's car for obvious reasons, but the friend's car as well because the women had driven it so close to the crime scene. Then, Golazzi double Yuski walked over to the 2 hysterical friends of his victim and told them he would give them a ride to the police station to get their statements. Around 3:00 p.m. that afternoon, Golazzi double Yuski walked into an interview room at Easton Police Headquarters and sat down across from Carrie, who had been crying so much that her eyes were red and bloodshot and her voice was hoarse. Golazzi double Yuski started with the basics, asking Carrie how long she'd been friends with Devin. Now, in a homicide investigation, Golazzi double Yuski knew that everyone connected to the victim starts off as a suspect, but neither Carrie nor the other friend, Michelle, seemed particularly suspicious, at least to him so far. That was until Carrie started talking, because right away she explained to Golazzi double Yuski that she and Devin were not just friends. They were actually in a relationship together, although she admitted she was also technically married to somebody else too. And Carrie didn't stop there. She told Golazzi double Yuski that Michelle, the other friend who had been there when they found the body, was also in a relationship with Devin. But, like Carrie, Michelle was also married to someone else, another man, and she was living with him. Golazzi double Yuski could barely keep this straight, but he also just couldn't believe what he was hearing. In the first 5 minutes of his interview, he already had a list of 4 people: Carrie, her husband, Michelle, and Michelle's husband, who were all romantically linked to the victim. The potential for jealous rivalries here was through the roof, and so they were definitely all suspects, and so they were all going to need an alibi. So Golazzi double Yuski'd old Carrie to slow down and asked her about the last time she had seen Devin in. Carrie took a deep, calming breath. Then she said that she and Devin had been fighting recently because Carrie was really upset about Devin's ongoing relationship with Michelle. She said that Michelle and Devin had recently gone to St. Croix together, and it just really upset Carrie. Golazewski nodded, but inside he was thinking, this is sort of like textbook jealous rivalry, Huey. However, Carrie went on to say that their most recent fight had not been as bad as some of their other fights. She admitted that on other occasions when they got into fights, she and Devin would get physical. But most recently, she said their fight had just been them yelling at each other. And then after this heated argument, Carrie said she had actually gone with Devin to Michelle's house, where Michelle's husband had told Devin to take Carrie back home again. And so Carrie said Devin came back to the car and did doctor her back to the apartment, and she got dropped off at about 11:30 p.m. And then Devin left again a little while later to presumably go back to Michelle's, but apparently she hadn't made it there, because Michelle had called asking Carrie, where's Devin? And she said, I thought she was with you. When Carrie finished, Golazewski just sat there trying to make sense of this very complicated story she just told him. Of all the romantic partners in Devin's life, it seemed to Golazewski that Carrie was physically at least the closest to her, given that they lived together. And so, that put her pretty high up on the suspect list. But on the other hand, she was being extremely candid about the ugly side of their relationship, which made him think, she might not be trying to hide anything. After Golazewski wrapped up the interview, he told Carrie she could go. Then Golazewski walked out of the room, wondering what more his victim's other girlfriend could possibly have to say. But when Golazewski sat down to speak with Michelle, Devin's other girlfriend, the other friend who found the body, he immediately sensed that this was going to be a very different kind of interview. Carrie had been almost shockingly honest, but Michelle seemed far less interested in talking much at all about her personal life. She downplayed her relationship with Devin, saying that while they had been romantically involved in high school, they were just friends now. So typically, a person lying about their romantic affiliation with a murder victim was a huge red flag for Golazewski, but this case was a bit different. In the year 2000, being gay or bisexual was not as widely accepted as it is today, and so it was actually more surprising to Golazewski that Carrie had been so open about it than it was that Michelle was sort of trying to downplay it. And so, he didn't press Michelle too hard on her romantic relationship with Devin. And besides, Michelle seemed to have a lot to say about Carrie. Michelle told Golazewski that when Devin did not return to her house after dropping off Carrie on the night she disappeared, Michelle called Carrie to find out where Devin was, but Carrie had sounded totally unconcerned. And then when Michelle had literally gone to Carrie's house to look for Devin, she said the only reaction Carrie had about the whole situation was just irritation. Michelle said she had been the one to insist on calling 911, like, we don't know where Devin is, we have to do something. But then when the police showed up, they didn't really take it seriously, which was upsetting. But what was even more upsetting was apparently Carrie's reaction to all this. Michelle told Golazewski that Carrie basically didn't care and had even tried to talk Michelle out of calling the police in the first place. Like she just didn't seem to care about Devin. After that, Michelle asked Golazewski if Carrie had told him about the fight where Carrie had stabbed Devin in the hand, and Golazewski just shook his head and said no. And so she told Golazewski everything Devin had told her about that particular incident. And then at the end of telling the story, she told the detective that really, that ordeal kind of summed up Devin and Carrie's relationship. And all of this did make Golazewski more suspicious of Carrie. But then again, this whole four-way romantic relationship just generally seemed highly suspicious to Golazewski. It was hard to try to sort out which of Devin's married girlfriends was lying about what and why. After wrapping up with Michelle, Golazewski had just one more interview to conduct that afternoon, and that was actually speaking to Michelle's husband, Brandon Bloss. Some uniformed officers had gone to Michelle's house while Golazewski was talking to Carrie and Michelle and brought Brandon in. And so, after leaving Michelle, Golazewski went to find Brandon. At this point, he didn't know what to expect. And for a second, when he entered the final interview room, he got excited because Brandon was sitting there sweating profusely and looking incredibly uncomfortable. And Golazewski's first thought was that boy, he must be nervous. But then Golazewski took in what Brandon was actually wearing, which was a long-sleeved shirt and jeans in the middle of summer inside of a tiny interview room with no windows and weak air conditioning. And so quickly his excitement disappeared. Brandon was not nervous, he was just hot. The whole interview with Brandon turned out to be pretty unhelpful. He seemed to have no idea that his wife was romantically involved with Devin, and he also didn't know about their trip to St. Croix. In fact, he said that Michelle had told him that she'd gone on a business trip to San Francisco, not to a tropical island on vacation with Devin in. Now it was possible that Brandon could be pretending not to know anything about his wife's relationship with Devin, but given how tight-lipped Michelle herself had been with the detective, Golazewski was inclined to think that Brandon might really be in the dark here. Eventually, Golazewski told Brandon he could go home. And once he was gone, the detective just sat by himself in the interview room, thinking over his entire suspect list. He had already ruled out Carrie's estranged husband pretty much as soon as he had run his name through the system, because what he found is he was in the military and living 250 miles away on a base in New York. And Michelle's husband, Brandon, didn't seem very promising either, since he appeared to be basically clueless about his wife's romantic dynamic. However, Carrie and Michelle, on the other hand, seemed like real possibilities. So Golazewski wrote out 2 applications for search warrants, one for the apartment Carrie shared with Devin, and one for the home where Michelle lived with Brandon. Golazewski was pretty sure Devin had not been killed where her body was found, and he figured with one of these searches, he'd find the real murder scene. So far, the investigation had been moving extremely fast, and to Golazewski's delight, he was able to get both warrants granted right away. So the momentum continued. Late on the same night that Devin's body had been found, 2 teams of crime scene technicians descended on the 2 properties and began searching for evidence. Golazewski went first to the home where Devin had lived with Carrie, and the first thing he noticed was the place was in shambles. Furniture was overturned and strewn about like a very intense fight had taken place there. In the bathroom, a few members of the forensics team had found what appeared to be a car's floor mat in the shower, just like the floor mat that was missing from Devin's car. And so the running theory became amongst the people on the scene that the mat was there because clearly it was being washed, and probably recently. And so Golazewski watched as someone from forensics sprayed the shower floor beneath the mat with luminol, a chemical compound used by law enforcement to detect blood. And immediately the area that was sprayed began to glow blue, suggesting that there was indeed the presence of blood either on that floor mat or in the shower. Now the luminol test was not 100% accurate, but at this point for Golazewski, it was good enough. And so as he stood there looking at the glowing bathroom floor, he realized he might very well be standing in the home of his killer. By the time Golazewski made it over to Michelle and Brandon's house to check on how the search was going over there, it was past midnight. So he was tired, but he was also feeling pretty good about the state of his case. And initially, when a crime scene tech began walking him through Michelle and Brandon's home, he felt even better because there was no blood at all inside of Michelle and Brandon's house. There was no sign of a fight either. But then the crime scene tech told Golazewski that they had found some blood with the luminol test out in the backyard, on a pool cover and on the nozzle of a hose. Golazewski frowned. Until this moment, he had felt lucky to have found blood in one suspect's home. Now, he had blood in both the homes where all his suspects lived, making this thing even more confusing. Now, he was fairly certain that Carrie, Michelle, and Brandon had not all worked together to kill Devin. And even if they had, they wouldn't result into separate murder scenes miles apart. Golazewski checked his watch, and he saw that at this point, he'd been awake for almost 24 hours. And so, he decided to let the crime scene unit finish processing both homes and go get some sleep. He'd come back fresh in the morning and hopefully, then things would look clearer. When Golazewski walked into his office the next day, on June 16th. So, One full day after Devin Guzman's body had been found, he found her autopsy report waiting for him on his desk. And it was gruesome. The wound to Devin's throat was a 4-inch-long cut that went almost all the way to her spine. The cut had severed her tongue and also sliced in half both her right carotid artery and also her right jugular vein. When the coroner originally pulled her body from the car, they thought for a moment that her head had actually been completely cut off. Devin had lost almost all the blood in her body before she was placed in the car. So, Gola's Abelewski had been right that she had been killed somewhere else, like Carrie's shower or maybe Michelle's backyard. But as he continued reading, he realized he had been wrong about something else. The coroner had put Devin's time of death somewhere between midnight and 3:00 a.m. Until this moment, Golazewski still thought that Carrie was his best suspect. But now he thought of something. Carrie didn't have a car to kill Devin and leave her at Canal Park. Carrie would have had to walk 8 miles back to her apartment, which would have taken at least 3 hours. And so, obviously, she had not done that because she had been at home when Michelle showed up looking for Devin at 2:00 a.m. And so, suddenly, Michelle was looking a lot better as Golazewski's killer. And that's when Golazewski's desk phone rang. An officer on the other line told the detective that he had this strange caller on hold and that this guy was saying really weird stuff about the Devin Guzman case. The officer said he would patch him through. Golazewski dropped the stack of papers on his desk and picked up a pen, just in time to hear the voice of a man who introduced himself as George Vine Jr. The man said he was a friend of Devin and Michelle, and a few months ago, Michelle had offered him sex or money to, quote, get rid of Devin in. Now at the time, he said he just laughed it off because he knew how volatile Devin and Michelle's relationship could be, and he figured this was just more of that. But now that Devin was dead, he wasn't so sure. And now, neither was Golazewski. And so, Golazewski now had a whole new theory for this case with Michelle, not Carrie, at the center. But almost immediately, he started running into new problems. George Vine Jr.'s story sounded like a slam dunk, but when another detective went to take his statement, he found that it was actually months old and pretty vague, and that Vine had no corroborating evidence. And as Golazewski and his team began the painstaking process of conducting interviews with every family member, friend, and neighbor of Devin's they could find, more cracks formed in the Michelle theory. 2 separate sets of interviews threw Golazewski off. The first set was with Michelle and Brandon's neighbors. They told police that Michelle and Brandon fought with each other constantly, and that contrary to what Brandon had told Golazewski, he didn't know about Michelle and Devin's relationship, and he wasn't happy about it. And one of these 2 neighbors had actually heard Brandon arguing with Devin on the same night Devin was killed. And so this made Golazewski think that he should be looking more closely at Brandon. However, the second set of interviews muddied the waters even further and pointed him right back at Carrie, because her neighbors said that on the night of the murder, they heard fighting too. Now Golazewski already knew that Carrie and Devin had fought, because Carrie herself had told him this. But Carrie had claimed that the last time she saw Devin was at about 12:00 a.m. when Devin left to head to Michelle's. Her neighbors, though, said differently. One woman said after hearing this fight, she had walked past their apartment at about 1:00 a.m. and she saw that the front door was open, and inside she said that she could see this woman laying on a couch wearing a green jacket. This was obviously significant because when Devin's body was found, she was being covered by a green jacket. If what this woman said was true, it meant Carrie lied about when Devin left her apartment. The final complicating piece of evidence arrived late that afternoon. The crime scene techs attested the blood found at both Carrie and Devin's apartment and Michelle and Brandon's apartment. The blood that was found in Michelle and Brandon's yard couldn't be matched to anyone because it was too diluted. But the blood in Carrie's shower was a match for Devin in. Less than 1 week into his murder case, Golazewski now had 3 suspects. They all had motive and opportunity, and they had all lied to him. And Golazee I.W. Ski had witnessed statements and physical evidence that made all of them look guilty. But Golazee E.W. Ski knew they didn't all murder Devin, and he was stumped as to how to figure out which one did. Devin's funeral was held on June 21st, 6 days after her murder. 400 people attended her funeral, and right around that day, Golazee E.W. Ski and his team sat down with all their files and went back to square one. They went through every interview, every piece of physical evidence, every observation that any of them had made during their investigation so far. And as they did this, they ended up stumbling upon the sort of unusual plan that they believed would point them to their killer. On June 28th, about a week and a half after Devin Guzman was killed, Detective Golazee E.W. Skis at in an unmarked police car parked on the side of a street. It was a Wednesday, which was important because Wednesday was trash day, and Golazee E.W. Ski was waiting for one of the suspects to leave their home and bring their trash to the curb, because their trash was not just trash. In Golazee E.W. Ski's eyes, it was evidence. And in the state of Pennsylvania, once someone puts their trash out on the curb for collection, the trash is no longer considered private. And so the cops don't need a search warrant to go sifting through it. This kind of curbside search is called a trash pull. So now, Golazee E.W. Ski was betting on bags of trash to close this case. Eventually, his suspect emerged carrying their trash. They put it on the side of the road, and Golazee E.W. Ski waited until they were back inside their home. Then he climbed out of his car, grabbed the trash, put it in his trunk, and drove to the police station. Once inside headquarters, Golazee E.W. Ski brought the trash bags into an evidence room, ripped them open, and dumped their contents out on a table. And then he began the very dirty work of sorting through all the smelly junk, the rotting food, the discarded receipts, the coffee grounds, the wet paper towels, and balled up clumps of newspaper. But then, right as he reached the end of the bag, he found something. This discovery would trigger the police to exhume Evan's body and look inside of her mouth. And once they did this, they had their killer. Based on evidence collected by the Easton Police Department over the course of a nearly 2-month investigation, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Devin Guzman in the early hours of June 15, 2000. Devin Guzman had actually left her killer's home, but she eventually came back. And when the killer saw her, all the rage they'd been feeling for weeks exploded, and the killer lunged at Devin, but Devin fought back and, for a brief moment, Devin escaped their killer and began to walk away. But the killer took the moment that Devin's back was turned to come up behind her with a knife, and they reached around and they viciously slit her throat. Then, after Devin had bled to death, the killer dragged Devin's body to Devin's own car. She put her body in the back seat along with a decoy knife in her hand, and then the killer drove the car all the way to Canal Park and left it there. Now, the killer might have gotten away with it except for the bite mark they didn't even realize Devin had left during the fight. And the reason they didn't realize it is because Devin did not bite the killer. She bit the killer's accomplice. And the accomplice, not really realizing how significant the bite mark was, had just dressed the wound as if it was just any other wound. They had put gauze and bandages over the bite mark, and unfortunately for them, but fortunately for law enforcement, those bandages, when they were discarded in their trash, well, police were able to actually see the bite mark on the bandage. It retained the bite mark and gave away what it had been dressed over. Now, Golazee E.W. Ski might have noticed the bite mark on the accomplice's arm when he interviewed them, except the accomplice was wearing long sleeves in the middle of the summer. The killer was Michelle, and her accomplice was her husband, Brandon. The blood identified in Carrie's bathroom was indeed Devin's, but it did not come from her murder. She had simply bled in the shower naturally, just close to the time that she was killed. The karma turned out to not have any blood on it at all. Instead, it was stained with pickled beet juice which Devin or Carrie had coincidentally tried to wash off in the shower. Devin's body was covered in dirt and grass stains because she was likely killed outside in the backyard of Michelle and Brandon's home. As for the eyewitness who saw Devon on the couch at Carrie's house on the night of the murder, they were simply mistaken about the time. Both Michelle and Brandon were arrested in August of 2000. They each blamed the other for the actual killing, although prosecutors presented evidence that suggested Michelle had been wielding the knife. On October 5, 2001, both Michelle and Brandon were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. They later divorced. As for Carrie, she was completely exonerated and actually wound up reuniting with her estranged husband. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.